Lectureship series. I'm Natalia Palacios, an assistant professor in the Educational Psychology and Applied Developmental Sciences program. This series is a sponsored event primarily by the Virginia Education Sciences Training or VEST Pre-Doctoral Fellowship Program, which is supported by the U.S. Department of Education Institute for Education Sciences. The VEST program applies rigorous research methods and analytic techniques in the social sciences to study school and classroom events primarily. Today we're delighted to welcome Dr. Jim Spillane. He is the Spencer T. and Ann W. Olin Professor in Learning and Organizational Change at the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University, which is my alma mater, and actually several. He's both professor of human development and social policy, as well as the learning sciences program there, and is a faculty associate at Northwestern's Institute for Policy Research. His own research has focused on issues related to education policy, policy implementation, school reform, and leadership, and has received funding from NSF, Spencer, and IES, to name just a few. And I heard that he recently got a major development with a new center on research use with collaborators from Harvard and Colorado. He also received the Versteeg Research Fellowship at Northwestern University and was elected to the prestigious National Academy for Education. I can also tell you on a personal note that he's a phenomenal mentor, and I was lucky to benefit from his instruction and guidance during my time as a doctoral student at Northwestern. Dr. Spillane will be talking for approximately an hour and will leave about 15 to 30 minutes for discussion or questions. And if there are any additional questions beyond that time, please email and such so that we can move on to the other scheduled meetings. Thank you for attending our series, and please join us for the next one. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you, Natalia. There are several reasons why I'm delighted to be here. First, I get to see Natalia, Nancy, and Vivian, who were students of the Human Development Social Policy Program. I can't take a lot of the credit for how wonderful it turned out. I did serve on Natalia's dissertation committee. I'm also delighted to be here because this IES program, the training grant program, I wrote, was the PI on one of the first proposals that went in from Northwestern. And that grant was funded along with 4 others. And the Curry School was one of those 4 original grants that were funded. And we just heard, as I think, hope I'm not talking out of school. We just heard, just like the Curry School heard, that we've actually got our 3rd training grant, which is really wonderful. And I think IES has done a lot of good things, but this is one of the most amazing things they've done. Of course, amazed that they're giving us another 5 years. Today, I want to, by the way, if you're a graduate student thinking about going to give a job talk, do not model your talk on it should come with a warning. At least if you were coming to Northwestern to give a job talk. Because I'm actually going to talk about multiple studies. I'm going to talk about the different ways, focus on a single study. So do not use me as the model. I want to talk about a problem that has faced American education for a long time. And this is relations between policy, whether that be local government policy, state policy, or federal policy, and this thing we call practice. Typically, at least in the education literature, we equate practice with the lowest level of the system, the classroom level. And one of the arguments I want to make is that that's problematic because practice happens at every level of the system, including the US Congress and we need to understand the relationship between policy and practice at these multiple levels. And I'm especially interested in the issue of implementation, the role of infrastructure redesign in that process, and of course, the core work of schools, teaching. And when I say instruction, which would be my shorthand for teaching, I'm not necessarily talking about what happens just inside classrooms. I'm also talking about how instruction figures and features in practice at other levels. I came to this country in 1988 as a graduate student. At that time, it's 25, 30 years ago, 25, 26 years ago, certain themes like standards, test-based accountability, monitoring and measuring individual and organizational performance, making instruction transparent, issue of choice. These were at best fringe issues. They were there, but they were not as prominent or indeed, might I say, as taken for granted as they are today in the policy discourses and in policy texts at all levels of the system. Now, no matter what way you look at it, to me that's a revolution. And revolutions can be for good or bad or indifferent, so keep that in mind. But this is a remarkable change, especially if you look at 50 years of implementation research that often read as lamentations about the limitations of policy. You know, if you read a lot of the implementation literature, oh, we tried, it failed, right? Policy cannot influence what matters most, what matters in schools and in classrooms with respect to teaching kids. This is a revolution. These things have become standards, especially in test-based accountability. You cannot engage in the conversation about education, education reform, policy, without encountering these ideas. What has the result of all this been? Well, this is not based on a comprehensive review of the literature, but I think for some reason, the references don't show up, but this is just a sampling. I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there is good, depending on who you read. There's some bad, depending on who you read. And there's some things that are just plain ugly, right? I guess we could debate this for a long time about where we fall here, but it's a mixed bag. Still, whether for good or bad, there's been a dramatic change in the fact that policy is getting inside schools, instructional policy, is getting inside schools and inside classrooms. And that, to me, begs the question, how do schools respond to this changing policy, discourses, and text? And how do these ideals become embedded, embodied in the day-to-day working of schools and local school systems that traditionally had ignored policy? As some of you will know, I take a sense-making perspective to implementation. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but very simply, I see policy as texts. Texts have to be interpreted. People, for some bizarre reason, interpret text differently. And that what they're responding to is not the policy per se, but to the policy ideas they come to understand from the text. And this is very important, of course, in a system such as the United States, where we have policy made at every level of the system about teaching and learning, where policy made at the higher level, its success often depends on the next level down. This interpretive process is critical because states interpret federal policy and then they create new representations that they put in their policy, and this process continues. What is very important for me in this is understanding how local schools make sense of these policy discourses and these policy texts. And I'm especially interested in how that happens in the interactions among people inside these organizations. We'll skip the Goffman for now, but if it becomes relevant, the framing of it, we'll return to it. A key idea in my effort to frame theoretically, conceptually this work has been the whole issue of coupling. And if you study organizations, if you study schools as organizations, sociologists have long held up the US education system as a prime example of decoupling or loose coupling. Coupling merely refers to the notion that organizations are made up of these interdependent elements, and these elements can be more or less connected with one another, both responsive and distinctive from. And elements can refer to a whole variety of things. It can refer to organizations and their relationships with their environment. It can refer to levels in a hierarchy. It can refer to the formal structure of an organization and its core technical work. If you read the literature, you will find all of these at play. Very often, people who do policy implementation research and education policy implementation research in particular, and I put myself in this group, you'll find that in the conclusion to our papers we say, well, the policy failed. To be expected, the system is decoupled or loosely coupled. End of story. And that's not a very satisfying explanation to anybody who's reading it, because what can we do about it? Recently, one of the people who originally came up with the idea of coupling, a couple of people are implicated here, John Meyer at Stanford, with Brian Rohn, Charles Bidwell at Chicago, but also the social psychologist Carol Weick. Weick has revisited his notion of coupling. He wrote one of the seminal papers in the 70s. And he said, enough about using this construct to refer to a kind of a static state. Organizations are either decoupled or loosely coupled. He said it's time for us to begin to look at coupling as a process. And a couple of sociologists and a couple of education folks have tried to revisit this and look at how the process of recoupling, rather than looking at these as outcomes or descriptors of how organizations are. And there's a few papers, one of them you read, well, I know it's exam week. Some of you may have read other papers from today, although I was very impressed with the people I've met so far who have read these papers. There's a classic piece in the last couple of years by Wendy Spillane, a sociologist at Northwestern, who looks at recoupling as a process. It's Spillane and Saunders, I believe. It uses performance metrics. I think it's US law schools, actually. And another piece by Tim Hallett in the American Journal of Sociology, which, using actually one of the schools I'm going to talk about today, also looks at the coupling or recoupling process. So I want us to, the puzzle I want to try and explore to the first part of my talk is, how does recoupling happen when you have these dramatic shifts to the policy environment, indeed the institutional environment more broadly, of American schools? A little bit about, there are two parts to this talk. So this is the first part, and then I'll talk about a series of other studies that are kind of follow-up to this. This is work done in Chicago. In one review a couple of years ago, somebody said, this data is very old. I don't think, why would you want to publish it? Which I found the strangest critique I've ever received on a paper. I was going to say all historians would be out of business immediately. But anyway, actually the timing of the study is very important. And it wasn't intentional, it was a kind of a fallout. This was a study of efforts to understand how schools lead and manage teaching and learning in reading, mathematics, and science. But we were in the field in at the turn of the century, basically. The late 90s, prior to NCLB, but actually we happened in one of the schools to extend beyond NCLB. But the district, Chicago, had already put in place, with the help of the state and state legislation, some high-stakes accountability that especially targeted low-performing schools, a probationary policy. And we looked, this is a subset of the schools where we looked really intensely. We looked at 4 schools. They vary on several dimensions that I won't talk about, but in terms of size, SES, and how well they were doing in the system. In addition to some survey research, we had access to the Consortium for Chicago School Research data for these schools, and we also collected some network data that I'm not going to talk about. Most of our work was interviews as well as a series of observations of what we later came to refer to as organizational routines. So we hung out at these schools, we went to grade level meetings, we went to faculty meetings, we attended various other routines that were in place. It would be like if I came here to study the Curry School, and I went to program meetings, I went to department meetings, I went to faculty meetings, I sat in on tenure review process, all of that. And we varied these across in the Baxter, Coast and Kelly. We had 2 years, and we varied them time of the day, day of the week, and we varied them across the year to the extent possible. Adams we spent 4 years at, because we had some carryover money, and we decided that this was a fascinating case for various reasons that I can talk about. Data analysis, this work has been analyzed in various ways. For the purpose of the paper you read, I think there are 4 phases of the data analysis process that are important. We constructed in-depth cases of schools from the very start. These were kind of living documents that were updated with each round of analysis. We did some closed coding of interviews using hyper research. These were around things like organizational routines, roles and responsibility, policy. And we did closed coding of field notes and meeting transcripts using in vivo. These looked at things like technical core, i.e. any reference to teaching and learning, which is the core work of the organization, policy, etc. And open and closed coding for phase 4, just in one of the schools, Adams, of 22 meetings transcripts. These were videotaped meetings that we transcribed in detail. We open and close code these around social tactics, policy, professionalism, and a variety of things. I'll talk about these later. Oh, by the way, feel free to, if you have a question, sorry, I take it for granted. If you have a question, you want to clarify something, just ask me. If it's something, that we want to go down a long path with, you might hold off until the end. Feel free to. We created coding manuals for all of our closed coding. I'm just giving you a sample. This is one of the social tactics that I'll explain to you in a little bit. Asserting in-group membership. We typically have a description, definition of the code, followed by an example of what would count under this. Sometimes also, but we also put in something that you would not code under this, but we, for some reason, do not. So, the first set of findings. And actually, let me tell you the big argument, and then let me break it down into various steps. The first thing I want to argue is that for school leaders, the redesign of the school's organizational infrastructure was central in their efforts to respond to a change in government policy, and indeed, as I'll try and show, a broader change in the discourse, in the policy discourses about improving schools. It's too easy to think that Chicago created probationary policy, schools responded like this, because actually a lot of these changes were in the works prior to the legislation, the policy going into effect. And these were important because school leaders negotiated the meanings of policy in designing and performing these routines. And I'll show you this as we go. This represented a fundamental transformation for these schools. and that in their efforts to do so, school leaders, again, not just principals, not just assistant principals, not just administrators, teacher leaders also, and this is important, school leaders relied not only on their formal positional authority, but they also relied on a whole host of what I call persuasion tactics to try and cajole and convince teachers that this was a legitimate way to go to think about their work. In other words, these efforts to define what teachers should teach, what materials they should use, to create standardization within grades, also called into question what it meant to be a teacher and who should have authority. So it took a lot of persuading on the part of these teachers. And I guess the big take-home message from this, I'm going to go through each of these, is that really recognizing the centrality of organizational and system infrastructure redesign in the implementation process is critical, especially for the sorts of changes that we've seen over the last 20, 25 years in American education policy. These are the papers, you've read one of them, there are others that touch on the same issue. Let's begin with the first argument assertion I want to make. This is the notion that school leaders work at aligning their school's organizational infrastructure with government policy and with instruction by designing or redesigning their organizational infrastructure, and that these redesign efforts were motivated by an effort to promote standardization, accountability, and monitoring of instruction. This is very important. Infrastructure is something we all take for granted, and we forget that infrastructure is not neutral on core aspects of what we do. As I go, I'm going to tread in a little bit more conceptual framing. Critical for this, the framing of this work, and here's an example of a conceptual framework that came in not prior to data collection, but actually came in at the data analysis phase. We were looking at all these things that were going on in these schools. They were creating grade level meetings. They were creating 5-week assessments. They were creating things like real men read. And so what are these things? How can we make sense of them? And luckily, I'm surrounded by very smart people. And somebody said, you know, you should look at this work in organizational routines. It's been around for a long time. It goes back to Herbert Simon and others. But there's been some very interesting new work that suggests that the dominant approach to organizational routines is that they're bad, right? They inhibit change. They preserve the status quo. And recent work by Martha Feldman and some of her colleagues suggests time out. Actually, routines may indeed also be a key source of change in organizations. And I won't go into this in great detail, but Feldman and Pentland, in a wonderful paper, take the routine of faculty hiring, which a lot of you are familiar with, and it resonated with me right away. But and they argue that routines can be both a source of conserving how we do things and a source of change. And especially if we think, and here she is using Latour's notion of the ostensive and the performative. We can think about a routine as having, if the dean said to me, tomorrow, Jim, we want to hire somebody in policy next year, I want you to chair the search. It's not like I have to go home and spend a day reflecting on, oh, the search, what would that be like? Right? There's a script. I have a script after 18 years at Northwestern. There's a little script that's triggered, right? It's not a Shakespearean play, right? It's pretty broad. It has certain steps in it. So that's the ostensive aspect. And again, this is from Latour's work. And then there is, of course, the actual performance of the routine at any one place in any particular time. And not to get too dramatic, too theoretical, the beauty of what Feldman and Pentland do here is that they show how routines can both structure, can both influence how we work as organizations, and how at the same time it is our work as members of that organization that can transform these things. And it's, of course, this huge debate in sociology, efforts to combine structure and agency, which, you know, they've written about for 75 years, and I'm not sure they've got, I love sociology. I'm not sure we've made a lot of progress, but this to me brought a very complicated idea, Anthony Giddens' notion of structuration, and made it real, right? I remember searches at Northwestern where faculty on the search committee got very upset because the faculty wouldn't hire the candidate that they wanted, the committee wanted to hire. And the faculty said, well, the person won't get tenure in 6 years. There's no way, look at the resume. And the committee said, well, why did you tell us that early on? So, well, you didn't ask us, right? So as a result of that experience, we now have to send the resume of our finalists to faculty. We're very small, 27. We have to send the resume of anybody we're going to bring in for a job interview to faculty and give them 48 hours to raise a question. So you see what I mean? This, okay. There is concerns about the late Michael Cohn at the University of Michigan has written about how the word routine has unfortunate connotations in everyday use. And he's written a beautiful paper about how routine may be more like what John Dewey meant by habit. And after I read it, it's great, it's beautifully written. I said, habit has all the same problems that routine has, so I don't think we're trading off much here. But routine, by routine, I do not mean necessarily basic, mechanistic sorts of work. All work involves routine. I get into trouble with this with some of my friends in teaching, who study teaching, because they think it's not professional, right? Anne Lieberman, a good friend of mine, we were keynoting the same event about a year ago now. She got really upset when I was talking about routine. So my answer was very simple, and God forbid you had to go and you had a heart issue and you went to see your cardiologist, right? And the cardiologist said, we're going to have to do some open heart surgery. And he said, you know, you don't have to worry, we'll see how it flows. I'll experiment a little bit here and there, right? And I said, yeah, I would run 100 miles, right? Routines are fundamental to all work, including what we see as some of the most challenging and ambitious work. In fact, in many respects, I think routines allow us to offload some basic kinds of things in order that we can engage in some invention. So in all of this, I'm pulling out routines and I'm seeing them. This is intentionally done, it's not an error on my part. I'm pulling them out of this thing that I call an organizational infrastructure. And it's done like this because infrastructure, it's my attempt to concretize, to bring alive sociologists' notion of social structure. There are all these things in our organizations and in the systems in which we work that structure our everyday interactions with one another. And they're taken for granted, so you have to stare a little bit there to see everything that's in them. Because we don't notice them, right? For the most part. In fact, I don't have my nice slide. In fact, it's like the infrastructures in our homes and in our neighborhoods, right? The only time we worry or wonder where the water comes from or how the electrical system works is when it fails, right? And it's the same for these things. Okay, so in these schools, over our 4 years, we were struck by this effort to build these routines. Now, the schools did other things. They created protocols, they redefined formal positions, so there were other infrastructure redesign efforts at play. But central was the creation of, and these are the 4 schools, of these new routines, of the redesign of existing ones. They all look very different at first blush. These are 4 schools, same district. Some of them are within 5 minutes, actually. Baxter and Coaston are within 5-minute drive of one another. But the names are actually, as I'll argue in a second, the names are actually very deceiving because the fundamental principles, if you will, that were embodied in these routines were quite simple. Making instruction transparent, creating routines to standardize teaching, in particular content coverage, within grades and across grades. And we'll see some examples of them at work in a second. The routines serve, according to the organizational members, they serve various functions. These are based on a kind of these are based on our analysis. This is what people told us was the purpose of these routines. Just so you have an example, the breakfast club routine was unique to Adams School. It was put in place because teachers complained about professional development, dog and pony shows, bring in somebody from outside, no relevance to what we're doing, no relevance to the challenges we're facing. They complained about, so the school leadership team got together and said, let's create a opportunity for teachers to get together to learn around issues that are central. And once a month, they would get together, they would read one or two summary articles of the research on a topic, classroom discipline, using reading circles, stuff like this. There'd be a teacher leader, and they would discuss the article and discuss the implications of that for their teacher. Often it was a critique of this research that it was completely useless and of no relevance to what they did. I just want to be clear, I am not saying anything about the efficacy of any of these routines. That's very important. This is where people often go, but that's not my point. The 5-week assessment was really critical at Adams, and this gives you an idea. Basically, they had said, we get these tests, we're held accountable based on these tests. By the time we get the results, my kids have moved on to another grade. So they said, okay, if we really want to improve kids' achievement as measured by the state test, then we need some other sorts of assessments that help us figure out what they are. So they designed this 5-week assessment. I'm just putting up some of the, these are some of the design principles that went into it. And by the way, this was not, they sat down for 3 months, they designed, then they implemented. They had some ideas, they put it into practice, and they redesigned as they went along. Basically, they reverse engineered the state test. You can call this teaching to the test if you want, but they reverse engineered the state test. They said, here are the skills covered in the state test. For this first 5 weeks, you should focus on teaching these skills, and we will test them at the end of that 5 weeks. And then they would, based on the corrections, the results, they would decide what to teach, what to reteach. They would decide how to focus professional development. They would have their meetings, their breakfast clubs around issues related to that. This is what I mean by design work. This is what I mean by designing organizational routines. And here is, we don't have to talk about it then. Here is the kind of script that we extracted from what people told us. This is very important. What people told us about how the 5-week assessment worked. Here are the steps. This is kind of, if you said to somebody at Adams School, a teacher, I want you to take over the 5-week assessment for the first marking period. This is the kind of script that we think would have been. Anybody at Adams, by the way, could say to you, 5-week assessment, oh yeah, that's the 5-week assessment. A couple of things on this. By the way, the literacy coordinator at Adams, her work was structured entirely, well, not entirely, but in great part around the 5-week assessment. And despite a dramatic change 2 years into our study, the principal and assistant principal left for promotion purposes, not because there was any problems. And here is the new principal saying, we're still doing this. So these routines create continuity across time, even when you have a major disruption in the personnel in the school. A few years ago, I was doing a kind of professional development training for principals and school superintendents in Kansas. And one of the activities I like to use is to identify some routines that are used in your school around that are important for teaching. And one of the big ones that came up was grade level meetings. And then my next question is, and tell me why you do that routine. And the dominant answer was, well, I don't know. We've always had grade level meetings. They were here before I came. And this is not just schools. You can go into any organization. I promise you the same response. But I actually pushed back and I said, do a little simple calculation. Figure out how many hours, people hours, are spent over the average year in grade level meetings. And they were shocked by, if you look at the entire district or an entire school, you're talking about, sometimes in a school, you're talking about one person. Pause. Yes. You need to think about, why are we doing this? What's the theory of action behind it? Okay, so that's the kind of, here's the design efforts. I'm arguing that here are the efforts of these schools not to buffer policy, not to say teachers ignore policy. They're actually designing routines that are intended at recoupling policy, teaching, and school administration. That's their intention. Okay? But of course, we don't always believe what people tell us, right? We're a little skeptical, we're a little worried. What really goes on the ground? We actually find that these routines, this is my second assertion, that when we look at the performance of them up close, that policy featured both directly and indirectly in the performance of the routines, and that policy and teaching featured together very prominently indeed. This is the kind of crude indicator. I don't like this kind of qualitative analysis, but I use it all the time. These are just references across all transcripts, field notes, across all the schools. Here is how prominent policy featured, references to teaching, the technical core, references to teaching and policy together. And what you have to keep in mind is that Adams was the only school that was under the threat, the real threat of probation because of performance. The other schools were not performing great by Chicago standards, right? But there was no way they'd be in the bottom 20%. One very interesting factor here is you see how language arts dominated, especially at Adams, because of the threat of accountability. So this is kind of one indication of this effort. Yes, actually, when you looked at these routines, you saw policy, you saw efforts to make decisions about teaching, and you saw these being invoked together. But let's look at up close a little bit. And I'm going to read a couple of these, and then we'll skip pretty fast through. This is at Baxter. There was no problem at Baxter with probation, but they took policy standards seriously. And here is Miss Sally. Miss Sally switched the topic of discussion to a uniform spelling program for the grade. She raised the point that it was important for the grade to be following a sequence for instruction for phonics. Miss Jill also wants to bring in one of her own favorite books into the curriculum, which she claims has a consistent format, which is the most important because students are missing a range of words. Ms. Delia, another teacher, then raised the point that she would be concerned that the grade would not be following the standards of the Illinois state in reference to Jill's book. Very mundane, you might say, right? But look at what's happening here. An effort to legitimate what materials to use. The state policy is invoked as a way of adjudicating on that issue. We see the same in the next example where you have one of the mathematics teacher leaders. By the way, keep in mind that these are teachers and teacher leaders and administrators involved in this kind. So here we have policy being invoked directly in the performance of routines to make critical decisions about teaching, such as what materials to use, what to teach, and in some cases even what teaching strategies teachers might use in response. It is a selective recoupling. Let us do another example. This is very similar again, the direct attention to what we should be covering given what's on the test. But often it was not direct reference to policy and the performance of routines as a way of legitimating what we should be doing. But local routines, such as the 5-week assessment, served as proxies for state policy. And we see this, basically, they served as a kind of a Trojan horse. We designed a 5-week assessment that mirrors the state test. Right? And then we performed this 5-week assessment inside our schools. We're basically doing what the tests, what those big bad policymakers out there are asking us to do. This is my way of, this is the great French, I guess, philosophers. Foucault, who talks about how we discipline ourselves, you know. The state does things, but then we do it to ourselves. This is an example, really, of policy taking on local manifestations. And by virtue of performing these routines, we are doing it. What I want to point out to you here is I have a package with lessons on teaching vocabulary. I'll pass it around. So here's an effort to say, students are having trouble on this particular skill. Here is some stuff you might use to do that. Again, no state policy here because the state policy has a local manifestation, but it's really recoupling at work. Okay, 30 minutes, good. I want to point out to you the fascinating dialogue 15. 30, 15. Split the difference. You have to do the math for me on that. What's striking in a lot of these exchanges is the notion that here is the grade level meeting. We have the literacy coordinator, I believe, saying, this is our own local assessment. It is for our purposes, and we're not trying to meet any state mandate here. All right? So you have this effort of school leaders saying, this is our test. This is not the big bad state trying to get us to do something. So here we have these policy proxies at play. These could be seen as symbolic efforts, right? So it's loose coupling or decoupling all over again. Because the schools could be doing these just to say, oh, look, we're doing what you asked us. But we actually didn't find, they could pass like that. But we also found really strong evidence, as we see here, as that these routines were really efforts to change, to influence the core technical work, and that they were not purely symbolic. This is reflected in the fact that they repaired these routines over time. When they found that they did not do very well in the state assessment. So well, why is it the routine isn't working? We had this 5-week assessment. So they went back and redesigned the routine in a way that they thought it would have a greater impact on what teachers did. Okay, let's change gears for a moment. I'm not going to this was teachers retrospectively told us this was a huge change from what the veteran teachers who've been around at least 5 or 10 years. This was a dramatic change. These schools were schools where people did their own thing, where there were different textbooks, different curricula used, even at the same grade. I'll skip the data for this, but I do want to. So if it was such a dramatic change, one of the questions we bring up, and this is the subject of another paper, which I didn't ask you to read because you'd never invite me back again. How did school leaders manage to accomplish this? And part of it was their appeal to authority, but they also appealed to, there are 3 basic mechanisms of control in a democracy. Right? There's the authority of the state, there are markets, and there's persuasion. And a number of people have written about this, Deborah Stone, Charles Limbam, Janet Wise, among others. And often we think of authority, the state, right, says, here are the standards for learning math in 5th grade. But very often, the actual work, right, of getting that to influence what we do as teachers comes down to persuasion. Right? And what was striking to us is looking at these persuasion tactics. We draw on the work of the Berkeley sociologist Neil Flickstein. He talks about social tactics as a way of exercising influence in society. And we use those as our framing for this work. Authority wasn't even, it's high up there. You know, a principal saying, the state says we will do this, or the superintendent says, or I'm the principal. I have forms downstairs that I can just sign and send downtown. But all of these are, so one of the important messages I take from this is that we know much less about the role of persuasion as a control mechanism when it comes to policy implementation than I think we do about authority and perhaps markets. That's an issue that if we had lots more time, I would give you lots of examples. So we're going to change gears. This is this effort to understand this recoupling process, this effort to understand how in the space of a quarter of a century, we could at least have selective recoupling going on inside American schools, inside American classrooms. And I've offered an account of how that, or at least how schools attempted to forge that. And the key kind of more applied message I take away from it is the importance of this thing I'm calling organizational infrastructure, of which routines are part, but also we can think about formal positions, among other things. This work has spawned a lot of thinking about the relationships between work practice in schools and school systems and this thing I'm calling infrastructure. And the second paper you read for today is an example of that. And I'm going to, really the issue is what are the relationships between a systems or a school's organizational infrastructure and teachers' work on teaching and learning. The paper you read today was with my good colleague Ken Frank at Michigan State. I'm one of his former students and a former postdoc of mine, Chong-Min Kim. And there's a follow-up paper that I've been talking to a number of you about. It's with Megan Hopkins and Tracy Sweet. Tracy's coming, I think, in a couple of weeks with Brian Junker. Tracy consults with me and writes with me on this stuff because the modeling is really, the modeling is, let's say, it's evolving, right? So Tracy and I have, and Megan have written another paper which is a follow-up to the one that you read. In that paper, in the AUJ piece, we looked at what factors are associated with teachers having a tie with a colleague within schools, right? And our reasoning, very simply, is everybody's talking about this thing called social capital, and that it has all these returns to it in schools. I like to believe that, right? But can we manipulate this thing? Can we do? Why do we have social capital? And a necessary, if insufficient, condition for social capital is the existence of a tie. So we're taking our first step. The follow-up paper does ties within schools and between schools with a different data set, and it finds roughly the same. We find the same. Good replication. We find the same factors, although we don't have a race effect because the data set is Nebraska, and Nebraska has mostly white teachers, at least the districts we were in. We do find that when it comes to ties outside your school, having a tie with another teacher in a different school but in the same district, that formal leadership position is a key predictor. Both formal leaders seek more advice and formal leaders give more advice. If you're a subject-specific leader, like a math leader or a literacy language arts leader, you're even the likelihood that you will give or receive advice is even stronger in your particular curriculum domain. So, now that Natalia has, how many minutes do I have now? Calculated?
13.
13. You might ask, I'm going to go through as much as I can. You might ask, why advice and information? I've hung out with cognitive scientists in this too long, but the notion that knowledge, knowing, depends on things like information and advice. And that we get advice, we get information in our exchanges with books, with people, and that may or may not enable us to develop a new way of knowing, a new way of understanding. So that's basically the rationale for this. You all know the literature on social capital. I don't need to tell you about that. That's why we look at social interactions. The research methodology, very quickly. Cloverville is the southeastern United States. This was a randomized control experiment that unfortunately went wrong. It was a principal professional development program, but has generated all this rich data about principals' work, how they time use, including this. Nebraska study, 2 mid-sized districts, 1 suburban, 1 rural. I'm going to focus mostly on the survey responses. This is our instrument. It has taken us a long time, many iterations, many revisions. These things are not as easy as you might think to develop, ask the right question. I'm still not sure we have the question quite right. And we got lots of surprises. For example, there's a question order effect. This is a paper with James Otziowski, who was worked with me for a while. We had always asked the English language arts. I do mostly elementary school. We'd always ask the English language arts question first. I guess I was a primary school teacher. English was most important, reading, right? And then math. And when we moved over to doing these online, we decided we'd do an experiment. So we actually changed the ordering. People were randomly assigned to one of these conditions. And lo and behold, there's a question order effect. If you ask the math question first, people who then go and answer the reading question, they'll nominate fewer people. And it's statistically significant. So this is why we had to go back and stop asking the question around the subject matters first, ask this very broad question that around the technical core, curriculum, teaching, student learning, generate as many names as possible, and then we repopulate these back into the survey, and we say, do you go to this person for mathematics, and so on. But these are the kind of validation issues we came up against. The beauty of this is that if I was only giving a social network talk, I'd be able to show you all these lovely pictures. This is a school in the Advice Network in Mathematics for 2011-2012. I'm not going to go into it, just so you know, when I show them, person A goes to person C for advice, person C goes to person A. The direction of the arrows are important. Person A goes to person B for advice, but person B reports not going to person A. Just to highlight the importance of the formal leaders. So, for the 2 papers that I'll quickly summarize, we used P2 models in 1. And basically the problem here is that you don't have independence when you use networks, because if I nominate Vivian, her nomination is dependent on me. And we have a huge problem, and therefore we have to go and rely on Dutch mathematicians who have devoted their careers to coming up with these models that help us to get around these issues. Actually, Tracy has the covariate block model, which we use in the second paper, is out of Tracy's dissertation in statistics at Carnegie Mellon. And then we use both inductive and deductive analysis of interview data in the second paper. There was no qualitative data that I used in the first paper. So the big take-home message is, yes, individual characteristics matter, gender and race in particular, when you have gender diversity. This is no surprise to sociologists or social psychologists. We like to hang out with people who are like us, right? But I think the take-home message is that formal structure matters more or has a bigger effect at least there's a bigger association with formal structure. And we see this in several ways in this data. Teachers more likely to seek advice from others of the same gender and the same race. But these other factors, like formal leaders more likely to provide advice or information, teachers in the same grade more likely to receive or provide advice or information, and teachers more likely to seek advice about a subject from teachers who reported more Ph.D. in that subject. The most recent paper, I'm focusing in on the between for math here. This is the paper you don't have, but I'm happy to share with anybody for summer reading, right? The big take home here again is when it comes to connections between schools, having a formal leadership position is strongly associated with both providing and receiving advice. This is the second paper. This is just taking out forgetting all within school ties, and just looking at the between school ties I think this is in literacy and math for Auburn Park, pseudonym. You see that the black dots are leaders in a particular curricular domain, math and language arts. The gray dots are leaders, and the white circles are teachers. What you see is the centrality of the formal leaders, especially the subject area leaders. So this is all very interesting. Our next move here, of course, is now to begin to build longitudinal models, because we have data over 5 years. So we can look at if your kids do very well at time 1, or if you have beliefs that are more in line with the curriculum at time 1, does that predict who you hang out with at time 2? In other words, are teachers smart? Do they go to teachers whose students are more high performing? Or do they align more with people who share their beliefs about teaching them? And then, of course, that tie at time 2, does that predict change in beliefs or change in student achievement? I don't think we'll see results from that at time 3 or time 4. But one of the things that was very helpful in this work was we were able to look and tease apart with our 34 interviews with a purposeful sample of teachers in 5 schools. We sampled based on some had like principal, math coach, but we also used the network data to pick teachers who were central advice givers and teachers who were not. So we had diversity across them. And what was striking here was so why is formal leadership important? Is it the hierarchy, right? The notion that, and why is grade level important? Is it simply proximity? We hang out in the same place, right? Where our classrooms are right next to one another. And actually, it's the story, at least based on our qualitative analysis, is more complex than that. Yes, formal position is not just about hierarchy, it's a marker of expertise. Both having the position and the training that's associated with the position. This is what psychologists call transactive memory. The notion that you don't know something, but you know who knows that thing in the organization. It comes from experience. Our organizations signal it in different ways. But the formal position also, its prominence seems to be underscored by other aspects of the formal infrastructure, the organizational infrastructure. And here, for example, we have Clarissa, a first grade teacher, talking about the professional learning community routine that they all do at every grade level. We do plan every week as a grade level team, and one of our team members was on our math toolbox for 2 years, and so she had insight into helping planning the curriculum, so that was very helpful. So these routines also signal expertise, our access to information that is influential in why formal leadership may be important. Very important, I think 33 of the 34 people talked about having a shared experience with somebody as an important. This did not come up in the quantitative analysis because we had no way of tapping into it. But what was striking, so I go to Vivian because I know Vivian. We have worked together or something. which makes sense if you think about it. But what was really striking to us is that shared experiences were strongly, so I think all but one or two people said, because we were on that, were involved in that routine together. We served on the district array meeting together. We were on the math committee when I first got here. And you see it really brought home here. This is a leader actually saying, Kelly, I've known her since the second year that I started teaching. She was the co-chair at the time of the Math Toolbox, and that's when I joined Math Toolbox. It was my worst subject. It was the one that I dreaded. By the way, this is the math coach now. So she was on the Math Toolbox, so when I joined Math Toolbox, that's how I came connected with her. And so she was a huge resource through the whole thing. I still go to her. I probably talk to her every day. So here, shared experience, but shared experiences are not, at least if we, based on this analysis, are not random. They're actually fundamentally shaped by the organization. So, take-home message, our work to date, maybe we're in year 3, 7 to go maybe because the data, my memo has an extra 7 papers to be done, but we'll see how far we get. That the formal infrastructure, organizational infrastructure, our school district infrastructure. If I had time, I would show you some changes over time in the district infrastructure. But these things fundamentally shape practice, everyday practice, around teaching and learning in schools and school systems. And I'm not talking about the classroom. Right? That's another part of the equation here that I'm not. And therefore that the redesign and the design of these systems is really fundamental to the implementation of policy, but also a key way of thinking about how do we reform teaching and learning in schools. One way to think about it is we have to build these infrastructures. And I think we need more research. I'm getting to conclusion. We have to, we'll skip ahead of these. See, if anybody wants a question, then you can do that. A lot of our work, and I do this too, we focus in on a particular aspect of the system, for good reason, because it's very hard to design studies that you can make strong causal inferences on if you have everything moving at once, right? So we do a study of coaching, or we do a study of a new curriculum, professional development, right? And that's very, very important. But it will set us up for another problem with how can we study how all of these components work together, the infrastructure, to enable and constrain improvement in teaching. And if you think about it, for the last 10, 15, 20 years, infrastructure organizational infrastructure has become a key policy matter. Charter school networks, comprehensive school reform models, right? This is about building infrastructures to support teaching and support improvement in teaching. So a key challenge, I think, is for us as a scholarly community is how do we continue to do the sort of work we do on understanding coaching as a practice, the efficacy of coaching. I'm using coaching just because it's the one that comes to mind. You could pick a lot of others. But at the same time, how can we do research that helps us understand how we build infrastructures in systems and in school organizations and study the efficacy, study how these work or not to improve teaching. Am I okay?
I think you are.
You forgive me for being a little...
Great. Do you want to take some? Yes.
So I enjoyed your talk. I guess what I'd like to have you speak about would be in the context of 2014 with the implementation of the Common Core state standards. If you could just help us think about like what aspects of formal leadership or organizational routines or even teacher-teacher interactions are going to be more likely to lead to schools really working well with implementing the Common Core, and or just where do you see some schools likely to struggle with regard to these particular issues you've laid out with sort of this pressure, this expectation related to the Common Core?
Yeah. So Peter, I don't have any 5-step recipes. But let me speculate a little bit. So schools for the last 10, 15 years have built all these infrastructures that are more around instruction than I think they've ever been. And policy is partly responsible for that, but I think a broader shift in the institutional environment as well. It's a function of the fact that our preparation of teachers, our preparation of school leaders, the journals, blah, blah, blah. Instruction is central, infrastructure needs to be tied to instruction. In a lot of places, that infrastructure has been built around, not everywhere, because of NCLB and how some states interpreted NCLB, has been built around basic skills. In other places, because of how the states there interpreted NCLB, it hasn't been built around basics, it's been built around more ambitious notions about teaching. If we could somehow identify, I mean, we could identify the states, can we identify what happens at the local level? It would be fascinating to see if one set of schools are better positioned to respond to the Common Core because of the nature of the teaching envisioned by the Common Core and envisioned by the assessments than another set. So I gave this talk, I don't know, somewhere last year, and they said, oh, all of this infrastructure stuff that you're talking about is useless, it won't work for more ambitious notions about teaching, right? That this was built around basic skills. So in part, I'm responding to that as one hypothesis. I'm actually not so sure about that. I think half the battle may have been that we have said, our schools have said, have recognized that we need to really build infrastructures that support, or that are focused on classroom teaching and classroom and learning. And that it may be an easier shift to redesign, or I'm speculating or hypothesizing. It may be an easier shift to re-engineer these to support the sort of more ambitious instruction that I understand is involved in the two assessment consortia. Now, that of course assumes that we will actually have Common Core. Are we in a state that voted?
We never adopted it.
Oh, okay. So, this is a whole other issue. But I do think we're at a very different point than we were in the late 80s, early 90s, when states began to talk about standards and assessments aligned with standards. And I think it's an easier issue to re-engineer these routines. That doesn't mean we don't have moment. Nancy?
So Jim, this isn't a question, this is more just sort of a thought.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, I'm intrigued by the pushback you've gotten on routine as negative.
Yeah.
So to take the human development side of human development and social policy, in the developmental world, particularly in child development, routine is key, right? It's really important. And so I'm curious about why for organizational people it's negative, but I wonder if there's some way you can couple those literatures to think about from the developmental literature what routine gets us.
Yeah. So in the organization literature, it was often portrayed as an inhibitor of change. I think the pushback I've got mostly though, because I think most organizational theorists accept that it can have this other way. Feldman has argued that very convincingly. I think most of the pushback comes from within the education world, and at the risk of getting into trouble. I think there are basically two grand narratives about education reform. And both are convinced that they have the only solution to improving America's schools, which I think is wrong. They're both. One grand narrative is that it's about the profession, it's about autonomy, and the other grand narrative is it's about either government or market accountability and controls. If anybody read the literature on professionalism, of course, they fully appreciate that professions are all about accountability. It's just a different control mechanism at play. So I think the pushback is routine is seen as anti-professional. It's seen as undermining autonomy. But the reality is, look at any profession, right? And the professions that we may or may not want to emulate, right? Trust me, they're full of routines, right? And there's routines. I mean, go to a hospital and you'll have your medical rounds, you'll have, there's, I can't remember what the word is, after surgeries, there's a post-op, and there'll be they'll debrief about what went wrong, why did this happen, and stuff like this. So there are routines built into all of this. It's just not the state, it's the profession. So I think the pushback is because I refuse to identify, not intentionally, I just don't see it like that, with one of these narratives. And the problem we have is that, as Jeff Hinnig's wonderful book, if you haven't read Spin Cycle, how many of you have read Spin Cycle? It's a relationship between research and media and policy. Read it. He uses the case of, Jeff is at Teachers College, he's a political scientist. But Jeff does this wonderful book on how, it reminds me of those programs that really drive me crazy, counterpoint, where there's never any dialogue, it's just, you keep saying your piece. Jeff makes the point very beautifully in this, and charter schools is his example, that when these scholars who do research in charter schools are in the public sphere, when they're out there, they tend to fall into one of these camps. I think they're forced into these. I mean, there's an expectation you take a position. And that actually when you read their work, there's a way more consensus. And I think these narratives, if they don't start to do that, we're in serious trouble. Because a lot of the same mechanisms are going to be at play, whether you want to build a strong profession. And actually, everybody's talking about Finland, right? Finnish lessons, right? And that teaching is such a strong profession in Finland. Well, teaching is a strong profession in Finland because the government made it a strong profession. I mean, the guilds, read the political science literature. It's not like this profession is somehow independent of the big bad government who's mobilizing incentives. So, I'm long-winded way of, sorry, responding to you.
So, getting to Nancy's point about the routines, is part of this gets back to the comment you made that when you asked some of these teachers, what's the purpose of this routine, they didn't have a good answer. It's sort of that's the way we've always done it, as opposed to...
These were leaders, Jim, sorry. Yeah, it was the school leaders, yeah.
As opposed to saying, they were engaged in the process of building a routine that actually did something useful for them. And so if routines are feeling as if they've been foisted on you and you don't understand their purpose, then of course it seems like a waste of time to you, as opposed to something
that you build, that you develop, or at least that you can, as we all do, you borrow. If I was going to do, let's say we wanted to design a new way of evaluating our graduate students every year, I am not going to design that from scratch. I'm going to reach out to you, I'm going to reach out to colleagues all over the country and say, what do you guys do? And then I'll design my routine. But then it is more local ownership. So I do think that's important. It would be fascinating, we can start, some of these routines are imposed, like in the state of Illinois, I think it still holds. School improvement planning is required in every school every year or every other year by state law. And it varies widely on how, some schools you go in, they're going through the motions. Oh, it's due next week. I'll go home and write it tonight, which completely defeats the whole purpose. And then other schools really get inside the spirit of it. I mean, it's the same problem in some respects with policy, right? Following the letter of the law versus really the spirit of it. And there could be a fascinating study done on that, because there are some routines that are required by either the district or the state, whereas others are local. But I think you're right in part. The other thing is a lot of schools, if you look at a lot of external reform initiatives, like comprehensive school reform models, learning walks, right, which a lot of people are selling, right? These are from outside, but they work with you. You have to buy into them, and that's a third model that might be. I think ownership is part of it. It certainly maybe in the reaction, but you could study it empirically, which I think would be fascinating. Vivian, and then.
So I was really interested. I guess I was a little surprised by this, by how, in some ways, it seemed at least in the sample of schools that you presented, it seemed that there was a fairly rational response of the schools to these to the policy, right? And so I wondered maybe I misinterpreted that, but I was really struck by your comment of staff sort of disciplining themselves by sort of internalizing what these policies were, and then
It's kind of scary, actually, isn't it?
right, and then putting on top of that additional sort of structure to support the policy. And I guess I was surprised by that, and
Yeah.
maybe is that a success from an accountability policy perspective, and that schools become more aligned, and that people in the schools work.
Yeah. So several things by way of response. Rational, yeah, I guess. There was a lot of pushback, but the pushback came, it varies. So Costin, I'm not going to read this, but read it because it tells you. At this particular school, which Tim Hallett has written extensively about, teachers pushed back. They did see it as a threat to the order that they were used to. Now, having said that, I won't put it down to just veteran teachers. They had also been through 3 principals in the space of 3 or 4 years. So it was an unsettled organization. But you see it here, people saying, I mean, it's actually, this case is amazing because it's a classic example of a principal trying to say, we have a problem, here is the problem. You see it up here. And teachers saying, no, we have no problem. Or teachers saying, yes, we have a problem, but the problem is not the teaching, the problem is all these kids from Eastern Europe that we're getting that don't speak English, so what do you expect? So you have this effort to frame the problem in different, I mean, if you can't frame the problem as a leader, it's very hard to bring everybody else along, right? And, contrary to popular opinion, problems don't exist under the counter or under the carpet to be discovered. Problems are socially constructed. We can use different data to construct the problem, or the same data to construct the problem in a different way. So, in the other 3 schools, I think we saw less overt resistance because you had more established leadership teams in place. And I think the retrospective accounts would have said, and actually they do say, well, when I started out trying to bring about this change, right, I had some teachers who didn't want to do anything. And they said, well, I encouraged them to move on. Or the principal said, I put some job advertisements in their mailboxes. So I think you have several mechanisms at play here, right? Yeah, well, the principal at Adams said that she inherited the librarian who refused to let the kids in the library to look for books, right? And she was told that you should not interfere. She's close to the alderman. This is Chicago. And contrary to reporting to the press, Chicago politics is very like today, like it was 50 years ago. But anyway, she said, I don't care, and she got the librarian to move on. But so because we've only one school where the principal was new, we see. The other thing I think that's very important here is, not to think of it as policy as the cause and these schools responding, because as I tried to say at the beginning, the discourse was changing. So the principal at Adams was a firm believer that the principal should be an instructional leader. She'd come out of Detroit, she'd taken our principal training, she'd encountered this idea. So, we tend to, in our field, because we study implementation of policy effects, we tend to blow up policy as if it's everything, but it's not. There are all these other parts of the institutional sector, the profession, the marketplace about what people were writing about. So these ideas were beginning to filter in. At Baxter, you had a principal who had come from, I want to say Minnesota, I think Minnesota, but who had come to Chicago because, just remember, and this is another very interesting aspect of the story, Chicago in 1988 had, through state law, created local control, local school councils. And the idea was that the principal would be in charge, the principal would have a budget, and there'd be a local school council that he or she reported to. And so basically now you have, most principals are middle managers because they're employees of the district. But in Chicago, you have a model where the principal is actually the CEO reporting to, well, this agency up here that's supposed to be supporting them, at least if you buy the definitions of CEOs. But this principal had come for that purpose. He wanted to create these schools where teachers made the decisions, where the neighborhood was involved. And all of a sudden then, even though he was not under any pressure, he sees what's coming. So he worked with his staff to create an accommodation, which is for 2/3 of the curriculum they had in math and reading, they were expected to align with the state, and for 1/3 they could be more decide themselves. But I think the fact that the discourse was already changing also meant that a lot of the overt resistance may have. Now you do have debates in these data about, well, why are the state telling us what to do? We're the teachers. We're the people on the ground. We know best. So it's not just about the technical. It is, but it's also fundamentally about our identity as teachers and school leaders. I mean, there's a whole issue here on how authority is being redefined in these exchanges. One more question. Yes.
May I have that?
Yes.
I'm struck in thinking about the organizational team question pursuing how any of us who are developing interventions, are very interested in that because that's essentially what we want to have adopted. And in particular, I'm focused at the school level, and so this is really interesting to me. And when people have a new thing, you want people to do a new thing, they are concerned about time.
Yeah.
Okay, so that means they have to think about all of those routines that they just do that are kind of a matter of course, like with some of the others we picked up on, which then starts me thinking about culture, because culture is sort of the taken for granted. It's the way we do things here, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you saw in some of those cases that you have all the nice data about, how when a principal or some leader wanted a new routine to be adopted, they got people to sort of look at what they took for granted, what made what's subject to them become object. Were there some routines around that, or did you notice anything in particular? Because that seems sort of important for bringing forward for analysis, what all do we do and how does this fit?
Yeah. I don't have a simple answer. I mean, we have, one thing again in the qualitative work to keep in mind is the period at which this was all happening. If these veteran teachers are to be believed, and I have no reason to doubt them because it was consistent with schools, there were not a lot of routines in place that were linked to instruction. Which would fit with what Dale Lordy wrote about in the 70s, this teacher closes his or her door. And there were more than any routines around everything, like morning assembly and stuff like that, but it wasn't. So in some respects, they had an easier challenge or an easier situation than you bringing in a new routine into a school where there are all these other routines going on. Now, having said that, you still had to somehow incentivize people to participate, because I think with the exception of professional development hours, which was quite limited, the principals had little authority over, had little leeway with out-of-class time. With the breakfast club, which is the one I can recall best here, the principal talked about several ways of getting people to participate. One thing was she provided breakfast out of her own pocket. And she felt that people do things for food all the time. I think anthropologists agree with that. So people came just because there was breakfast. And I think she said she started off the first year with roughly 50% of the staff, but by the end of the year she would have been up to 75 or 80. She also said, I started making important announcements at the breakfast club. She wasn't in charge of the breakfast club. She would attend and sit, and then she said, oh, there's a new pot of money for such and such. I have to get, and she said, I stopped doing those announcements at faculty meetings. And the word got out that this was happening. Of course, you could always subvert that. But the third thing was very interesting. She said that over time, and teachers actually said over time, that they began to, the teachers who were kind of, I'm not doing that. It's, oh, we're having great conversations. they began to hear their colleagues talking about things they were discussing. So it's almost like the thing was working for whatever reason, and the people who were participating would say, oh, I should do this. Maybe I should come too. So she claimed by the middle of the second year, she had up to most teachers attending the Breakfast Club and participating. I think it helps, going back to Jen's notion about ownership, it helped that one of the design principles, whether explicit or implicit, of this routine was that it was always led by a teacher, that the teacher picked the topics, the topic to be discussed with consulting his or her colleagues, and that the teacher picked the article and then facilitated the discussion. And that was evident when you watched these videotapes or field notes. Yes, you had the principal and the assistant principal at the back of the room, but it was always a fellow teacher. So I think that also, and I do think the fact that they felt that they had this complaint, professional development, these dog and pony shows, no relevance to what I'm worried about, and the leadership team say, well, okay, let's try and create some. I think that may also have helped with the, the 5-week assessment. There's a paper on the 5-week assessment in Teachers College Record that is a more complicated story. But again, I think there was an incentive built into it, rather than, you spend your whole year until February or March teaching kids, right? And then this test arrived that you have no clue how your kids are going to completely, you don't have any clue how they're doing. That the fact that, oh, every 5 weeks you're going to tell me how my kids are doing in the material they're going to be, that, and as a teacher, I would much prefer to have something like that than hearing that, not identifying any problems. Does that kind of answer?